Welcome to my Bob Thurman podcast. I'm so grateful some good friends enabled me to present them to you. If you enjoy them and find them useful, please think of becoming a member of Tibet House US to help preserve Tibetan culture. Tibet House is the Dalai Lama's cultural center in America. All best wishes. Have a great day.
This is episode 268, The Yoga of Ordinary Living.
To say that an ordinary person can equal a Buddha in their enlightenment is something very shocking and startling within the Buddhist culture. Vimalakirti is, this in this other chapters of Vimalakirti where he rejects, for example, Shariputra, he rejects Moggallana, he rejects many of the great disciples of the Buddha, both lay and monastic disciples. This again in the West is hard to understand. For us, it's hard to understand the impact of that. We have to realize this is like, these people are like St. Paul or St. Peter. They are like the angel Gabriel. They are really extraordinary persons within that culture. To have somebody kind of rejecting them, criticizing them, like exposing their imperfections and moving them yet a step further is an unbelievable thing. I mean, it's incredible. It's not just like another person, something like that. Because these persons are enlightened, actually. It's just that their enlightenment is too partial, he finds it in some respect, as we'll see. So in any case, to have Vimalakirti being such a being, we can see it, a being who can pick up a universe in his hand and put it over some other place, take a whole galaxy and pick it in his hand type of thing. I mean, it's this kind of extravagant image is completely inconceivable. And yet this guy is totally ordinary. He lives in town, he goes around, he's an ordinary person. So this is why Vimalakirti, in addition, is known for, that is the first thing. He's known for his ordinariness. He's known for being a symbol, therefore, that one can remain a part of ordinary society and nevertheless be perfectly enlightened, which itself is already some kind of very challenging idea in regard to Buddhism. The second thing that he's particularly known for is his silence. There's a famous context, we will come to it in the text, where he maintains a certain kind of silence. He doesn't speak in a specific context. Interestingly, within the scripture, there are other silences that are not held up as anything marvelous. In fact, there's one monk who remained silent at one point when being questioned by a visiting goddess, and she just gives him hell for remaining silent. She considers it a pompous silence, a pretentious silence. It is not silence. It is the silence. But yet Vimalakirti maintains a certain silence, and that is called the lion's roar of the Vimalakirti silence. It's a very profound silence. So that's the second thing he's famous for, which is in a way that relates to what is known as the teaching of non-duality, teaching of the nature of ultimate reality. And that's the second thing which he's known. The third thing for which he's very famed for is his teaching of what is known as the reconciliation of dichotomies. Well, is one way of putting it. Another way, well, no, save that. Make that the fourth thing. The third thing, we'll call it the inconceivable liberation. Teaching of inconceivable liberation. The teaching of the inconceivable liberation is this kind of miraculous kind of teaching. Again, I'll come to it. I'm just giving it kind of ahead of time, a summary a little bit. And he says that the inconceivable liberation is to understand like how each atom contains a universe, at least, if not many universes. It's this kind of macro, micro inconceivability type of idea that is talked about. It is the inconceivable liberation. And for that, Vimalakirti is also famous. Fourth final thing is the one that comes back to the title of our weekend, which is the yoga of ordinary living, in a certain sense. Yoga. Did you want to speak? No. Yoga of ordinary living. The yoga of recognizing the meditative component of just ordinary life. This one is what is known as the reconciliation of dichotomies. Yamaka Vyatyastya Ahara in Sanskrit, never mind the spelling. Yamaka Vyatyastya Ahara. It's a very interesting concept in Sanskrit. There's some notes in my book on that, but my translation on that. But it's a very funny thing because it's a rhetorical device in Indian rhetoric. It is a poetical device. It is the pairing of contrasting couplets, the pairing of opposites or paradox. It could be called paradox, the reconciliation of paradox in a certain sense. But I didn't like to use the word paradox because these are dichotomies that are total contradictions and yet are reconciled. They are not just left hanging. We have a connotation with the notion of paradox that it's sort of something that you from which you draw the conclusion that logic is useless or something, and you just sort of forget about it. You go sideways, you leave it alone. But this kind of reconciliation of dichotomy, as is the use of paradox in Buddhism, is not like that. Hey, how you doing? Stay away. You can sit up or down. You do not reconcile dichotomies. If you sit down, you need a cushion. Somebody we have a next to right. I'm sure you will need one. So, reconciliation of dichotomies, you do not leave the paradox unresolved. The paradoxes have to be resolved. In other words, one has to find how they can actually be settled in a certain way by reconciled in this sense. Resolved maybe is not the right word, it's a little too strong, but reconciled is the right word. In this sense, this implies an understanding of enlightenment of Buddhism in relation to reason that is unusual perhaps and surprising to some of us. And we will have some dialogues also and discuss some of your other ideas about it. Many people have the idea that reason is useless and you have to throw away your reason and logic and this and that. And this is not Vimalakirti's idea. This is not my idea. We'll have some good debates if you happen to have that idea, which a lot of people do tend to have. And so his reconciliation of dichotomies is again it is like being in ordinary life, being fully engaged, fully busy, fully responsible, fully involved, and yet totally on the path of enlightenment, totally in quest of enlightenment. And this, again, remember, not just enlightenment envisioned as some sort of understanding, but enlightenment envisioned as a total evolutionary fulfillment, both of mind, of understanding, and of body and feeling. The achievement of a certain different kind of body, even. As they say in Zen, and Dogen says, for example, in Zen, they say achieve enlightenment with your body and mind. But what does he mean by achieve it with your body? This is an interesting question. Enlightenment with the body, at least in the Mahayana mainstream tradition, and I will argue in regard to Zen also, because Vimalakirti is a kind of source of Zen, that enlightenment with the body means where every one of your cells is enlightened. But not just by some saying, oh, my cells are enlightened, but you yourself are aware of your cells being enlightened, that means. That means your cells have become compassion vessels. That is, your own DNA, in some sense, you are responsible for your own DNA, that means. That means your DNA is manifesting enlightenment forms and embodiments, consciously. That means you have what they call in Tantra, you have achieved the subtle consciousness that can identify with one's own cells, one's own DNA. That's what enlightenment with the body means, if you think about it. The ability to use the body as a vehicle of compassion. The Vimalakirti is a source, therefore, of the general Mahayana and is considered a member of the Prajna Paramita, or Transcendent Wisdom Collection. The Prajna Paramita, P-R-A-J-N-A, Prajna Paramita, as it sounds, P-A-R-A-M-I-T-A, means transcendent wisdom, or what the Westerners, what Khans have called perfection of wisdom, which I don't like perfection, but transcendence of wisdom, I think it's better. And it is the profound teaching of emptiness, and it is the sort of the fundamental scripture of the universal vehicle, the Mahayana Buddhism. And there's a large number of scriptures. There's 17 main Prajnaparamita scriptures. But Vimalakirti is considered a source in a sense of that. Vimalakirti is considered a source of the Pure Land scriptures, in that Vimalakirti centrally deals with the issue of faith in Buddhism, with the notion of these Pure Lands or Buddhist heavens, the realms of Amitabha and other people. So Vimalakirti also is considered to be a source in the Pure Land school of Buddhism. Vimalakirti is considered to be a source in the Lotus Sutra schools of Buddhism, Lotus and Parinirvana schools of Buddhism, which were very important ones in Japan and China and in India before that, but we know more about the formulation as schools in Japan and China. In that they were, in those schools, the Lotus Sutra was at the center, and therefore a certain vision of Buddha as paradoxically sort of beyond all problems, a sort of perfected universe kind of vision, which we'll talk about when we come to that. Sort of that this world is actually a perfect world, sort of like Voltaire, Candide, the best of all possible worlds. A certain notion about this as the best of all possible worlds is what those schools are involved with, although it's not as simplistic, of course, as Candide's notion was, although it's very in the same area. Vimalakirti is also considered a source of what is known as the inconceivable liberation type of sutras, that is to say the garland sutras, what is known as the flower ornament nowadays in English sutra. And each of these, when I say sutra, I mean a vast body of literature, like a vast New Testament or Old Testament, a whole Bible in itself, or a number of Bibles. Each of these collections of scriptures, or some of them have 52 scriptures included within the one scripture, like the Garland scripture does. The Ratnakuta, jewel heap scripture, which is also in the class of the Vimalakirti, is a kind of source for. So the Vimalakirti belongs to all of the major fields of the Buddhist scriptures. And now if we go beyond the Buddhist scriptures, and the major schools that were founded on Buddhist scriptures, we take Zen. You will immediately see when we come to Vimalakirti in his room receiving thousands of people in his small room, which is a small empty room which has no furniture in it, in which thousands and hundreds of thousands of people enter. And then they bring in things that are 30,000 miles big and so forth. All come into this little room, We have the model of what is known as the 10-foot square room of the Zen master in the Zen tradition. I don't know that some of you may know something about Dokusan, what they call our Sanzen. The Zen master's room is this small empty space in which in some sense, the disciple meets the Zen master and has a confrontation with ultimate reality, in a sense, with the Buddha, with all the Buddhas rolled into the one Zen master in a certain way, if you understand Zen in that way. You can understand Zen in that way. It's therefore a major source for Zen school, which was a school that existed in India as the Siddha school or Tantric school, and then in China as the Zen school, Chan school, and then Zen school in Japan. And that school, of course, was called the scriptureless school, the wordless school, the school without words. And Vimalakirti in his silence and so forth is a major source for that school in East Asia. And all the Zen masters refer to it. And the whole Zen literature, the literature of no literature, since you're not supposed to have one, but actually they have a vast, enormous literature. This literature of no literature is full of Vimalakirti. He's completely involved with that as well. And finally, which is very little known, and some people, I mentioned this in my introduction, which I wrote many years ago on this translation, brief introduction. Vimalakirti is actually an adept, what they call a siddha, a mahasiddha, a great adept. And in especially Nyingma lineages but also certain lineages common to all the orders, but particularly Nyingma, of particularly the Bodhisattva, the deity Hayagriva, if just, it may not mean anything to you, but it may. Hayagriva, which is the horse-headed Avalokiteshvara, the terrific or fierce form of Avalokiteshvara, therefore, of course, connected with the Nyingmas because Padmasambhava is the name of Hayagriva, and Padmasambhava was a kind of fierce form of Avalokiteshvara, an incarnation of Hayagriva he was considered to be. And this Hayagriva, who is the Bodhisattva, Avalokiteshvara, as you know, is the Bodhisattva of great compassion. Hayagriva is a Bodhisattva of great compassion in his form where he doesn't look very compassionate. He's all red on the face. In fact, his whole body is red. And he's going like this. Sometimes he has many arms and wings. Sometimes he only has 2 arms. And he has this horse's head on top of his head. And he is kind of compassionate in its terrific adamantine form where it is confronting evil and overwhelming evil with the force of compassion in a way, and yet without becoming evil, it's still being compassionate. Now, this Hayagriva practice, or the lineage of the transmission of the teaching of Hayagriva, in its prayers, what do you know but Vimalakirti is there. He is one of the original adepts, who had this lineage from Shakyamuni Buddha's time. In other words, according to that tradition, in the sense that these tantric lineages were existing even then in 5th century BC. This goes, of course, contrary to Western history of Buddhism notions, where they think the Tantra only came up 500 AD earliest. But according to Buddhist notions, it did exist always. And in the Buddha's time, these lay persons, like Vimalakirti, were the ones who kept these esoteric teachings. We can see that in Vimalakirti scripture, there's certain reference to this. And there are philosophical, in his notion of reconciliation of dichotomies, in fact, is a kind of tantric teaching, actually. And we'll come to that, why that is. So therefore, in this scripture, this tiny little scripture, which therefore one suspects, and so many scholars have thought of it as an anthology. And if one wants to be a modern, demythologized, secularized Westerner, modern, materialist, modern person, and not a superstitious, old-fashioned, primitive-minded person that sees bodhisattvas and angels flying in and out of the closets. If one wants to be a modern person, then one can see this scripture as an anthology, a brilliantly designed anthology, around the beginning of the Mahayana time, around the time of Christ, that contains all the threads of the Buddha Dharma. So that if one can understand this scripture, then one has sort of a good sense of actually every aspect of Buddhism is contained within it. And of course, the nice part for modern secular persons who live in the world is that it brings it into focus in the context of ordinary life. Again, that is why then I called this weekend the yoga of ordinary living. My own history with this, just as a personal note, is that Tibetans never, in spite of the fact that they think of Vimalakirti as this great adept patriarch, and they pray to him all the time, in spite of the fact that they consider certain major statements of the Vimalakirti that are quoted in certain treatises that they read a lot, that they pay a lot of attention to, especially by Shantideva, the Shiksha Samuccaya and others. There are famous quotes from Vimalakirti that they therefore know as quotes, like four-line, small verses that are sort of famous, that most Tibetans know by heart. In spite of that fact, no Tibetan, to my knowledge, has ever read the Vimalakirti scripture. The last one I know of who read the Vimalakirti scripture lived in the 18th century. His name was Rowe Dorje. And he only read it because he was considered the reincarnation of Vimalakirti, actually. Probably. Or maybe because he read it, his disciple considered him an incarnation. Or maybe he read it because he lived in China and he was involved in trying to dialogue with Chinese Buddhism. So he knew some of their sources. He spoke Chinese and he translated Tibetan things back and forth into Chinese. And between Chinese and Tibetan. He was a Mongolian himself, from Inner Mongolia, although he was a Tibetan incarnation. And he's the last one I know who refers to Vimalakirti and describes and talks about him in Tibetan. Like so and such a person, Otherwise, no Tibetan ever knows who Vimalakirti is. They never read the scripture. The only time they ever read the scripture in Tibet is when somebody's sick or somebody wants to generate some virtue and you hire some monks who come and read the whole canon at your house or on the porch or something. You patronize them for a few weeks and they read through it. But then they read it, you don't get to really follow the text because they read it like, that's how I heard it one time, it goes like this, Which is considered itself a wonderful thing, of course. Just in itself, the fact that the words, the logos, sort of the background radiation of the universe is sort of churning with the language of the Mahayana scriptures is itself considered a marvelous thing, and it doesn't matter that nobody listens to it, because the micronauts are listening to it. Those beings who are in the universes, in the atoms that are flying around in little ships. You don't read comic books probably. Your children are probably grown up. Okay, so with that kind of introduction, then, let us look at the scripture itself. And usually, often when we teach this, it's good for people to read it themselves. I apologize, I didn't bring enough copies. Any copies. I thought I meant to. I apologize, I didn't Xerox the whole thing. We might be able to do that. Anyway, slowly we can read it. I will just look at some main points, anyway, about it. Now, a Buddhist scripture itself, really, if a Tibetan saw me putting it on the floor like that, they would be annoyed. It's considered a very, a sacred thing, even in any language. Oh, actually, any word is considered sacred. Did you realize this? Do you think Buddhism is into silence and mysticism and words are useless and inadequate? We hear a lot about that. And there are some kinds of teaching in Buddhism that mention that here and there in an effort to jolt people out of their usual unthinking use of words. But once that has been said and done, words are very valued in Buddhist cultures. Language, speech, words, they are unbelievably considered important vehicles of liberation. They are the unique and important human capacity. They are what enable you to become Buddhas. They are what set us off from the animals, etc. They have an unbelievable trip on words as far as respecting them. They consider their own Tibetan language, the letters, to be the gifts of Manjushri. Special revelation from Manjushri were the letters. We don't have to go overboard, but I'm saying that at least a scripture, like a book like a scripture, is something they keep high. It's like actually like an icon like that. An icon like that, one wouldn't sort of want to sit on it or something. One would feel funny, even if one wasn't a Buddhist or, if it was another religion, it wouldn't matter. But an icon is something, although it's just a picture, and no Buddhists think that, except some simple popular level, think that the picture is the deity. But they know it's a symbol. And yet, as a symbol, as in a sense a representation, a sort of medium through which the actual deity can become manifest to a person, it's a sacred object in that sense, an icon. And that kind of sacred icon is an icon of the Buddha's body. By the same token, a scripture, like a Mahayana scripture, is considered an icon of the Buddha's speech. And then the icon of the Buddha's mind is a stupa, this kind of monuments that you have in Asia. So the body, speech, and mind all have different kind of icons. Okay, anyway, the sutra begins, I put down here, in my translation, reverence to Manjughosha, the ever-young crown prince. Manjughosha means the gentle-voiced one. Manju means gentle, Ghosha means sound or voice. Vowel, it also means gentle vowels, or sound, speech, gentle speech, you could say. And Manjughosha is the name of Manjushri, which means gentle glory, which is this bodhisattva who is the bodhisattva of the word. He is the angel in Buddhism, the archangel in that sense. Bodhisattva really is a kind of angel. Some of the supernatural ones are anyway. We can also be bodhisattvas, we ordinary people, without being archangels. So you can have ordinary bodhisattvas, sort of what they call beginner bodhisattvas. Then you have these bodhisattvas who really are practically or sort of Buddhas who, after becoming Buddhahood, make a vow that after Buddhahood I'm going to continue to be a bodhisattva type of thing. And they're really like angels. They're sort of just like archangels, I think you could say. And Manjushri is the archangel involved with wisdom, with the word, with speech. That's his sort of special thing. And therefore all translators throughout Buddhist history, and those who were seeking the text and working with the text and seeking the understanding and investigating the process of communicating that understanding to others, always consider their patron to be Manjushri, this Bodhisattva Manjushri. He is always symbolized as an ever-young crown prince. Why is he called the ever-young crown prince? He is the eternal youth, actually. Kumara Bhuta, you could also simply call it the eternal youth. Manjushri, the eternal youth, because this is an important point too. In the Buddhist civilization, wisdom's symbol is not the old gray-beard elder patriarch. Even though in Indian culture and in Chinese culture, that was, of course, the symbol of wisdom, as in other cultures. It was one kind of symbol of wisdom that also coexisted in Buddhism, that symbol of wisdom. The elders are not venerated. But part of the Buddha's own radical, as my son calls it, petty radical trip, Buddha was a real radical. We forget. We think now he became a founder of religion and he himself sort of therefore is sort of the patriarch of the institution. One forgets that he was a total radical, the Buddha was. The Buddha left his kingdom, he left his father. He broke all the religious precepts of his Vedic culture. He left his wife and child, newborn child, actually rather mean. His wife said he had a heart of stone. It took his wife 35 years to forgive him. Even after he had been a Buddha for 30 years, finally she decided, well, maybe it was worth it. And after their son had become a saint and perfectly enlightened, instead of totally damaged for life type of thing, which she was sure he had been, by the bad father who left him, she finally forgave him. But in a way, she was right and not wrong to do this. It was not that she was worldly, as some pious Buddhist might have said, she couldn't see the Buddha. On the contrary, she was correct. She saw the Buddha as being harmful, actually, in his radicalness. It was extremely radical, the Buddha. He's just shattered. Imagine that, leaving your wife and child, like the day after the child is born. What kind of a bum? And in the lives of the Buddha that are a little more literary, his Yashodhara, his wife, really goes wild on this. She says, what a stone-hearted monster! And she's holding up the baby like this. There's some fantastic scenes in the various dramatic and literary versions of the Buddha's life where she really flips out, And then she tries, even when he comes back 20 years later as he's a big Buddha, coming in with all the disciples, and to his ancestral home, to his own nation, which he doesn't do he stays away for about 20 years. When he does come home, Everybody else, it takes his father a little something to come around, but finally everybody else is very happy with the Buddha and is respecting him and so on. And she won't come to see him. Then she sends the son, who is 20-some years old, by that 25 years old, and she says, "Go ask your father for your inheritance." He's a penniless, monk. And she thinks he's going to waste him this way, puncture this sort of guru balloon that he's making there. And the son says, "Daddy," Mom, well, he's bigger than he says, Pop, Mom says that I should ask you for my inheritance." The son may be a little bit getting off on this too, like this is the bad father who left, And the father says, "You want your inheritance?" He says, "Yeah, that's what you said." I said, "That's what I said." "Okay," he says, "Ehi bhikkhu." He says, "Come here, bhikkhu," monk. "Come here, monk." He says, "Come to here." And when he comes into the shadow of the Buddha, of his father, when the Buddha's shadow falls across him, he attains enlightenment. Of a certain type, certain degree, he attains arhatship, sainthood. And suddenly the world transforms itself for him, And the Buddha said, "Is that okay? He says, "Yeah, that's okay." And but his wife goes, "Darn it, she's not doesn't get to her yet." Finally, she does. She becomes one of the first bhikshunis, one of the first nuns, and the patriarch of the matriarch of the order of nuns, and she becomes a great teacher and so forth. Ultimately, but it takes her many years to come around. I didn't mean to go into this digression, but it's just that Buddha had a very radical element to him. So Manjushri, therefore, the symbol of wisdom in Buddhism, is a 16-year-old internal youth who's orange-colored, who looks really sassy and radical and kind of a little bit aggressive-looking. And he holds a sword in one hand, which has flames at the tip, which radiate all kind of sunlight. They are solar flames, which are burning away the darkness of ignorance, and the sword is cutting through the network of delusion. Symbol of wisdom, therefore. It's golden sword that he holds, which is the sword of intellect. D, it is the sword that emerges from the syllable D, which means genius or intellect. And on his other hand, he holds this lotus stalk, which comes over here, and there's a lotus there, and then there's a book on that shoulder, which book is the Prajnaparamita, the mother of all Buddhas, as she is called, the book of transcendent wisdom. And so he's not an old, it's not old conventional wisdom. It's not the inherited wisdom of the tribe. It's not ancestral wisdom. It's a different kind of genius that cuts through all kinds of inherited conventional wisdoms, in fact. It's the symbol in Manjushri. Therefore, they call him the eternal youth. Wisdom is eternal youth. And therefore, wisdom is to be found in all sorts of different kinds of unexpected places. Wisdom is found, actually there's an intimation, wisdom is found in all women, our wisdom. There's a kind of teaching like that, which freaks out the monks. We come to it in the sutra. Especially women are more wise. There's a kind of teaching like that in the Mahayana. Prajnaparamita is a goddess. She is the mother of the Buddhas. Some scholars have thought she connected to the Sophia, the Gnostic goddess of wisdom, Sophia, the Western one. And that Sophia and Prajna are sort of, if not cousins, they are different facets of the same goddess. Some have thought. And I think it's probably so. So it is not, in other words, the conventional sites of wisdom. Okay, now we begin the sutra. Now, in the beginning of all sutras, the sutra itself begins, the translator may begin with a reverence to Manjushri, but the sutras begin with a reverence to the Buddha, of course. Reverence to all Buddhas, Bodhisattvas, Arya Shravakas, and Pratyeka Buddhas in the past, present, and the future. Buddhas, of course, you know what Buddhas are. We see more and more what Buddhas are thought to be in this tradition. Bodhisattvas are those beings who are warriors for enlightenment, who are heroes or heroines seeking enlightenment. Sattva means a warrior or a hero, a heroine. Bodhi means enlightenment. Then note, even though this is a Mahayana or universal vehicle of what I call a messianic Buddhist scripture, I call the two kinds of Buddhism monastic Buddhism and messianic Buddhism nowadays. I think those are really the best. After some years of talking about it, I think they are the best descriptive terms for them. The Mahayana Buddhism, universal vehicle as they call it in their own language, Buddhism is really a messianic vehicle. In other words, the Bodhisattva is a messiah, or messias, which actually is a word, believe it or not. Female of messiah is messias. Messias. And there's a being who resolves to save all the world, save all beings. That is really what a messiah means. Messiah is actually the metaphor in Hebrew and Greek, Christos, which is the same word, comes from political metaphor, of course, of a crown prince who is anointed in the context of the coronation ceremony and who takes the vow to be responsible for the whole society as a king. And that's where it comes from, the metaphor within both Hebrew and Greek. But in spiritual terms, it means a person who resolves to take a kingly responsibility, not the sort of just big shot idea of kingship, but the responsibility idea of kingship for the whole universe, for all beings. Therefore, it is a resolve to be something like a god almost, as far as the responsibility side of being a god, not just the power side, but the side of having to take care of everyone. So the messianic, although this is a messianic Buddhist text, not a monastic Buddhist text, in the sense that the monastic Buddhism, the Theravada, or the the sort of early Buddhism, what you call early Buddhism, does not put that kind of pressure on its audience. That is to say, the difference between monastic and messianic Buddhism is that in messianic Buddhism, Buddha himself is the Messiah. In monastic Buddhism, I mean, Buddha himself is someone who is presented, even in monastic Buddhism, as having saved the world, as having attained perfect enlightenment, as having the perfect method of how everybody can save themselves from suffering. In a sense, he left his kingdom, the Buddha did, but he comes back to his kingdom. When he left his kingdom, this is often misunderstood in the West, where you think of Buddhism as sort of world negating, you concentrate on suffering and the cessation of suffering. People don't even think of the third noble truth, which is the truth of cessation, as being the cessation of suffering. They think of it as the cessation of life itself. And they think, therefore, of the goal of Buddhism as being some deathly sort of thing, just to get out of the world, you see. Whereas actually it means the cessation of suffering. It doesn't mean the cessation of happiness. If there is such a thing as happiness without suffering, which they say there is. But the Buddha, when he left his kingdom, in fairness to him, he did tell his father, he said, "Dad, okay, I will stay and run the kingdom as you wish. And you, Dad, can retire and go to the woods, which is what you want." That's what his father was wanting, He was saying, "You want to go out and attain Buddhahood? That's great. I appreciate that because I want to go attain Buddha." The father said, "And I've been running the kingdom for 30 years now, and you're my son, and you're of age where you should run it. And I should be able to retire and go to the woods and attain Buddhahood." Enlightenment, He didn't use the word Buddha at that time. So he was ruining his father's retirement, you see. Another radical thing is, his wife and child, and the poor father wasn't getting to retire because he had to wait for the grandson to grow up. And not only that, he comes back and takes the grandson to the monastic order, so he can't be king. He really wrecks the whole country. Buddha does. But he does say, in fairness to Buddha, he says to the father, he says, "Okay, Dad, I'll run the country. Now, as a king, I'm supposed to be responsible for all the citizens." "Yes, son." "Well, okay, now then, if I'm going to be responsible for the citizens, I have to, of course, protect them against what really bothers them, don't I?" "Yes, son." "In that case, it seems to me that what really bothers the citizens of our country are the suffering of birth, the suffering of sickness, the suffering of old age, the suffering of death. Now, is there something in the kingship manual, Dad, that you're passing on to me that can enable me to take care of the real problems of my citizens?" "Oh, come on. What's the matter with you, We talk about taxes, armies, national defense, sickness, old age, birth, and death. We can't deal with this." "Well, then, I'm sorry. I would not be a good protector to my people. I would not be a good king. I might sit on a throne and we would want to, but it wouldn't be any good. Wouldn't be of any help to them. I'm going to go find out some way of being a real king, being a real helper to them." And father was helpless, speechless, of course. What could he say? So, in other words, Buddha was doing this radical thing, in the name of the ideals, in each case. In other words, to be a real king, you'd have to be able to really protect people from their real enemies, not the fake enemies, the Russians or the neighboring Koshalans or the Magadhans or the different enemies of the Shakyas in Buddha's time. Those are not the real enemies. The real enemies are birth, death, sickness, old age. So, therefore the Buddha's coming back and founding the monastic Buddhism. The Buddha was this Messiah who came back as the King of Kings, the person who was a king who could really help his people. And he chose in that context not to settle back in his old throne. He set up a new throne His new throne was the throne of a Buddha on the sort of lion throne of this sort of universal situation, with his army being his monastic order, in a way, his royal army, his subjects. A new kingdom was the kingdom of the Sangha, the community, which had both monastic and lay people, but the monastic part was an essential core of it. The Sangha, the holy community, the jewel of the community. This new community within a community, a new social world within the society that he established. So now in Messianic, but the one thing he doesn't say to any of the people in that community in the context of monastic Buddhism or early Buddhism is he never says to anybody, you have to become a Buddha. You have to also, like me, go through this whole evolutionary thing. He tells all these jatakas also. Then once he's there, he tells, how did I get to be a Buddha? Well, I was a king in this life, and I was an animal in that life, and I gave my body to the demons in this life, and they let the ghouls drink my blood in that life, and so forth and so on. He gives this long story of former lives, of all these sacrifices that he did. He shows the whole sort of course of nature as a process of self-transcendence and self-sacrifice and love and compassion, and how he thereby developed into this evolutionary form of perfect Buddhahood. He shows that. But he never tells anybody, you have to go through that kind of long, difficult, arduous evolutionary path. He just says, you renounce greed, hatred, and delusion, you attain something, you will achieve liberation, nirvana. Each person is left to think that they as an individual can somehow save themselves if they put these methods into practice, and indeed they can, and they do. Like the son just walks into his shadow by his special karma, and just walks into his father's shadow and he achieves enlightenment. Just like a vibration, like the field of his father, somehow their karma, he remembers what he already knew in his former lives in a certain way. Just bam, and he's totally like free at heart, free in spirit, seeing through everything. But he doesn't say, okay, not only wisdom do you have to get, not only freedom of mind you have to get, you have to develop your compassion, your ability to help others, you have to go through a long billion lifetime cycle of attaining evolution, because if you told that to these people, it would be overwhelming. They would say, thanks, no big favor, Thanks a lot, I thought I was going to get away from the local suffering. Now I have to go and die a billion lifetimes and be a crocodile and feed myself, become everybody's handbag for a billion years, Thanks a bunch. They would freak out and become nihilists, or they would change to some theistic, simple religion where they might get saved quickly by somebody all at once. And so he doesn't teach them like that in the monastic. Then the difference to the Messianic one is that in the Mahayana, after 4 centuries, in the Buddhist view, they taught the Mahayana, the Messianic Buddhism, right away as a semi-esoteric kind of thing. As you'll notice in this scripture and in others, the monks, the monastic Buddhist types are a little freaked out by this Mahayana. They're kind of really worried about it. They're very uptight about it. They feel it's kind of too much pressure on them in a certain way, too much responsibility. But Buddha said, for 4 centuries it will not become and it should not be spread. Just spread monastic Buddhism. Don't spread this Messianic Buddhism. It'll be secret. It's taken by the gods and by the Nagas, the dragons who live at the bottom of the ocean. They take the teaching away, according to the Buddhist's own myth, which fits with Western historical myth, who consider the Mahayana arose around 50 BC, 80 BC. It wasn't really even existing before that. That's why they talk about early Buddhism and then Mahayana Buddhism in Western history. And the way the two histories are the same, except the Buddhists think that it was there inside already. And but then this is the key point: the Mahayana, the Messianic Buddhism, makes no effort to eradicate monastic Buddhism. And this is a very important point, and one about which in the Vimalakirti is very much misunderstood, because Vimalakirti does criticize Shariputra's narrow-minded ideas, and all the other great monks, the famous great elders, what are called the Shravakas, the holy disciples, the apostles, the great monks, the Buddha's great apostles. He does criticize. He says, that's wrong, this is wrong, the other's wrong. But yet, when he does so, he says venerable, reverend. He bows to them first. He offers them a seat. He respects their office. And then he blasts their narrow notions or their misconceptions. But within the context of totally respecting them, respecting the monastic institution. Buddha, as we know, is a monk. He shows the form of being a monk himself, the head monk, the abbot. And he respects the Buddha in that way. And he never, in other words, although the Messianic Buddhism reaches out from the monastic beachhead, you could say, from the monastic sort of sanctuary, these sort of institutions planted like open centers, exactly actually open centers, planted within the cities and all around, not just ascetics in the woods, but right in town. So Vedic culture had nothing like that. There was no monastery. The idea of a monastery was not known and unheard of at this time. So monastic Buddhism is always, even within Messianic, even within Tantrayanic Buddhism, in the Tantrayana, the great siddhas, who are back into a new level of sexual energy, this and that, and they're like totally like doing this reconciliation of dichotomy to the hilt. Nevertheless, they have a thing where they're not supposed to stay in monasteries more than one night in their early Bible, because of course you would stay. The monasteries were like inns also. They were like Howard Johnson's and so forth, and the Buddhists, they were. You would go around, you could go sleep, there. There were no much, without being robbed and so on. But they were not allowed to stay more than one night in any monastery, the Siddha, because they were not to they were Buddhist, and they were not to in some way tempt or confuse or trouble the monks, you see, with their particular lifestyle and their particular type of vibration, these siddhas, these adepts. So they had a vow that they would not interfere with the monastic institution, even those, because the famous story of Naropa, where he disrobes and as an abbot of a monastery and goes out to the forest and says mantras and meets the Dakini and et cetera, and attains great sages. Some of you may know the great story of Naropa, the great Siddha. And so everyone thinks, oh yeah, they got rid of monasteries, but they never made any effort to get rid of monasteries. They may have personally left at their stage, but they themselves supported monasteries. Padmasambhava, the great Siddha, went to Tibet and enabled the Tibetans to build a monastery, himself being not a monk, himself being a Siddha, who was beyond being a monk in a way, but yet he preserved that institution, considered it super valuable. Therefore, this long digression relates to the third word of this text, Arya Shravaka. Why they salute the Arya Shravakas and the Pratyeka Buddhas, the holy disciples and the hermit Buddhas. The Pratyeka Buddhas are hermit Buddhas, a particular kind of enlightened person who doesn't live in a monastery, nor is the bodhisattva, he or she a bodhisattva, but just goes into the wilderness and lives just completely by themselves. There's a certain type of Buddha that lives like that. It's called a hermit Buddha. In the past, the present, and the future. Then this famous phrase, Evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaye, thus have I heard at one time. Evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaye, Bhagavan. It's the famous beginning of all Buddhist text scriptures. Thus have I heard. It means that it's like Milarepa's hearing, before he sings his song. It means that this is a genuine scripture, this is a genuine event that happened in the life of the Buddha, within the Buddhist culture. Someone heard it at a particular occasion, that means. It's not somebody made it up. It's not a general thing. It's a particular event and series of events and teachings in the teaching life of the Buddha. It is even said that in this word, Evam maya shrutam ekasmin samaye, in these syllables, all the Buddhist teaching is taught. In the Tantra, there's a way, the so-called 40 syllables, there's a way that each of them has a certain symbolic thing, and there are 40 verses relating to the 40 syllables which teach everything. And it is actually, in Guhya Samaja Tantra, it's a very interesting thing. Evam, for example, evam. Evam. E is compassion, and vam is wisdom, and so on. A certain type of thing like that. Evam means thus, though, thus. Unfortunately, in English, we haven't got a two-syllable word for it, thus. Evam, evam. Thus have I heard. Evam is, E is female, and vam is male, and so on. Compassion and wisdom, it goes on like that.
The Bob Thurman Podcast is brought to you in part through the generous support of the Tibet House US Menla membership community and listeners like you, and is distributed through a Creative Commons No Derivatives license. Please feel free to share, like, and post on your favorite social media platform. Tashi Delek, and thanks for tuning in.